My name is Lorraine Henderson. After 42 years helping struggling students, my own son destroyed me at my retirement party. I remember standing in that banquet hall, surrounded by people who loved me. Former students, teachers, parents whose children I'd fought for. The room glowed with flowers and warmth. There were speeches. There were tears. Beautiful tears. The kind that come when you've spent your whole life lifting people up, and finally they lift you back. I looked for my son every few minutes that night. Nervous? Excited. When Deshaun walked in, I felt my chest settle. He was there. My boy. The one I'd given everything to since his father left when he was 6 years old. I thought I knew what was coming. I thought my son would stand up and talk about the sacrifices, about how I worked myself raw so he'd never feel abandoned, about how I chose his tutoring over dating, about how I stayed late, woke up early, and poured everything into making sure he'd have a better life than I did. I thought he was coming to honor me. I was so wrong. What happened next wasn't just cruel. It wasn't just disrespectful. It was calculated, deliberate, and it opened a door to a betrayal so deep, so carefully planned, that I'm still processing it months later. But here's what I didn't know that night. My son didn't just humiliate me in front of hundreds of people for a laugh. He had already stolen from me. He'd already changed my retirement paperwork. He had already forged my signature. He was already waiting for me to die so he could collect the life savings I'd spent 4 decades building. My own child. The one I broke myself for. He was counting down until my final breath. That night, I learned something that changed everything. Sometimes the people closest to you are the ones sharpening the knife. Before we dive in, make sure you subscribe for more emotional, dramatic, real-life-inspired family stories. Also, download your ebook titled Suspense and Family Drama Short Stories by clicking the link in the pinned comment.
Let me take you back to where this story really begins. Not at my retirement party, not at the moment my son humiliated me, but to the woman I was before all of this fractured. I grew up poor, the kind of poor where your mother works 2 jobs and still can't pay the electric bill on time, where you learn early that love is something you show through action, not words, where you understand that your child's future is worth more than your own comfort. When I was 19, I made a choice that shaped everything. I decided to become a guidance counselor, not because it paid well, it didn't, but because I remembered being a kid with questions nobody would answer. I remembered needing someone to believe in me when I didn't believe in myself. So I worked. I studied at night. I borrowed money for college, and by the time I was 25, I was standing in a high school hallway in Atlanta, ready to change lives. For 42 years, that's exactly what I did. But before I talk about those students, I need to tell you about my son. Deshaun was born when I was 28. His father, Marcus, was charming at first, the kind of man who made promises that sounded like poetry. He told me we'd build something together, a family, a future. I believed him because I wanted to, because I was tired of being alone. Then Ari turned 7. When Deshaun turned 7, Marcus left. He didn't pack slowly or write letters. He just disappeared one Tuesday morning, left his leather jacket on the back of a chair, and never came back. No forwarding address, no child support, just absence and questions my son couldn't understand. I remember Deshaun asking me, "Did Daddy leave because of me?" My heart broke into pieces I'm still finding. That's when I made another choice. I wasn't going to let my son feel what I felt growing up. I wasn't going to let him think abandonment was his fault or his destiny. So I doubled down at work. I picked up extra hours. I stopped dating. I stopped going out with friends. Every dollar went to tutoring, camps, piano lessons, soccer teams, anything that would give him opportunities I never had. People used to tell me I was too much, too involved, too protective. They said I was smothering him. I didn't listen. Because I knew something they didn't. A child without a father needs a mother who shows up twice as hard. Deshaun was brilliant, patient, kind. He'd sit with me at the dinner table while I graded papers, and he'd ask me questions about my students. "Mom, why do you care so much about kids that aren't yours?" I'd tell him the truth, because every child deserves someone who believes they're going to be something great. He'd nod and go back to his homework. Those were the years I felt closest to him, not because everything was perfect, but because he understood what I was doing. He saw the sacrifice. He appreciated it. Then he grew up. He got into college, then graduate school, then a corporate job that paid more money than I'd ever see in my lifetime. And somewhere in that climb, something shifted. He stopped calling as much. He stopped visiting. The grateful child became a man who seemed embarrassed by where he came from. When he met Melanie, I thought maybe that was natural. You meet someone new, you focus on building that relationship. That made sense. But it went deeper than that. Melanie was everything I wasn't. Wealthy, polished, connected. She had parents who'd never worked a day they didn't want to. She grew up with trust funds and country clubs. And from the moment she met me, I could see it in her eyes. A calculation, a measurement. And the verdict was always the same. I didn't measure up. She'd make comments, small ones, the kind that sting because they're wrapped in a smile. "Lorraine, you should really let us help you move into a better neighborhood. This area is becoming so dated. Your work is so noble, but don't you ever worry about your students being ungrateful? I mean, you give them so much, and they probably don't even remember you. Deshaun was telling me how you used to make him do chores. Wasn't that a bit harsh?" And Deshaun would laugh along, or stay quiet, which was worse than laughing. Their daughter Ari was born when she was 7 years old. When Deshaun was 31. Ari was the light of my life. She had his eyes and my smile. When she was born, I felt like maybe I'd get my son back, like maybe we'd remember what we were to each other. For a while we did. But as Ari grew, Melanie started controlling access to her. She's napping. We have plans. She's too young to remember visits anyway. And Deshaun let it happen. The calls became quarterly instead of monthly. The visits became annual instead of regular. Birthdays were forgotten, not because of scheduling conflicts, but because I wasn't invited. Holidays passed where I didn't hear his voice. I convinced myself they were just busy, that success in his career meant less time for family, that this was normal. But normal doesn't break your heart slowly. Normal doesn't make you wonder if you did something wrong. Normal doesn't make you question whether the sacrifices you made were even worth it. That's what this was.
I need you to understand something about those 42 years. They weren't easy. They weren't glamorous. And they definitely weren't lucrative. I was a guidance counselor in a public school in Atlanta. Do you know what that means? It means you make about $45,000 a year if you're lucky. It means you work with 300 students, but only get recognized by the ones you saved. It means you spend your own money on supplies because the school budget ran out in October. It also means you become a therapist, social worker, mentor, and parent to kids who desperately need one. I had students whose mothers were in prison, students who were homeless but still showed up to class, students who were being abused but smiled anyway because they didn't want their teachers to worry. I had a boy named Marcus, funny how that worked out, who came to me with gang recruitment letters in his backpack. I sat with him for months, helped him apply to colleges, wrote him recommendation letters. He's a lawyer now. He still sends me Christmas cards. I had a girl named Keisha who was pregnant at 16 and wanted to drop out. I fought her mother, the principal, the entire school system to let her stay. I helped her get into community college while she was 8 months pregnant. Last I heard, she was a nurse. These weren't small victories. These were lives.
And I did this on a salary that barely covered rent, groceries, and Deshawn's needs. But here's what Deshawn saw. A mother who came home tired. A mother who sometimes fell asleep at the dinner table because she'd been counseling students until 6 and then grading papers until midnight. A mother who couldn't afford to take him on fancy vacations or buy him the latest video game system like his friends had. What he didn't see, or maybe he did and just forgot, was the why behind all of it. I remember one specific moment that crystallizes everything. Deshawn was in middle school, maybe 13 years old. There was a school dance coming up. All the kids were going, and he wanted new clothes. Not just new, expensive, designer brands his friends were wearing. I looked at my bank account, and I had $200 to my name after paying bills. So I did what I always did. I worked extra. I picked up summer school counseling, I tutored after hours, I took on additional responsibilities I wasn't even getting paid for. And by August, I had enough to take him shopping. He picked out a $200 outfit. I bought it without flinching, even though that money was supposed to go to my car insurance. He wore it to the dance, he looked happy, and in that moment, I felt like I'd done something right. But I don't think he ever knew what that cost me. Not just the money, the time, the exhaustion, the sacrifice of my own life. That's the thing about raising a child alone. You learn to make invisible sacrifices. You don't advertise them, you just do them, because that's what love is. But here's what I'm learning now, and this is important. Sacrifice without gratitude breeds entitlement. Deshawn grew up believing that struggle wasn't real, that money should appear when you needed it, that hard work meant going to college and getting a good job, not working 3 gigs and still falling short. When he got to corporate America, he excelled, not because he was smarter than anyone else, but because I'd taught him to work hard. I'd modeled discipline. I'd shown him that consistency and effort matter. But somewhere in that success, he forgot the origin story. He forgot that every opportunity he had was built on my exhaustion. Every door that opened was because I'd knocked on it for him. Every advantage he claimed came from a mother who gave until there was nothing left to give. Melanie fed into this. She'd tell him stories about how self-made he was, how he'd risen above his circumstances. She treated my sacrifices like embarrassing footnotes in his biography, not the foundation of his entire life. And he believed her. By the time he was 30, Deshawn had rewritten our history. In his version, I was overbearing. I was clingy. I was the poor mother who couldn't give him what he really needed. And he'd somehow succeeded despite me, not because of me. When he'd visit, which became rarer and rarer, he'd make comments, little digs disguised as jokes. "Mom, why are you still working so hard? You're going to run yourself into the ground." Translation, "Why are you still at this job? Isn't it beneath us now? I wish you'd let me help you find a better place to live. This neighborhood just isn't you." Translation, "I'm ashamed of where you live. I'm ashamed of this version of you. Melanie thinks you should retire. You've done enough." Translation, "Disappear. Stop existing in a way that reminds me of where I came from." I used to think these were genuine concerns, that maybe my son did worry about me. I was fooling myself. The truth is darker than that. The truth is that he resented me. Not consciously, maybe, but deeply, because I represented the past he wanted to forget. I was living proof that success didn't come easy, that there was no magic moment where everything suddenly works out, that sometimes you have to choose between your own dreams and your child's future. He chose to pretend that hadn't happened. And when I wouldn't disappear gracefully, when I kept showing up, kept loving him, kept being the mother I'd always been, he decided to punish me for it.
The school decided to throw me a retirement party without asking if I wanted one. My principal called me into her office in May and told me they were planning something special. I remember feeling embarrassed. I told her it wasn't necessary, but she smiled and said, "Lorraine, you've earned this." Looking back, those words feel like a cruel joke. They booked the banquet hall at the Hyatt downtown. They sent invitations to former students, their parents, teachers I'd worked with for 4 decades. They ordered flowers and a catered dinner. Someone made a slideshow with photographs spanning my entire career. Me, 25 years younger, standing next to kids who are now adults with children of their own. It was beautiful, genuinely beautiful. I bought a new dress for it. Burgundy, elegant, the kind of thing I don't normally splurge on. I had my hair done. I felt nervous in a way I hadn't felt in years. Not nervous about the event itself, but nervous about my son. I kept thinking, he'll see all these people. He'll see what I've actually done. He'll understand. I called him 3 times, reminding him about the date. I texted Melanie. I asked about bringing Ari. She said yes, and I felt my chest settle. The day of the party, I arrived early. The banquet hall was already transforming into something magical. There were centerpieces on every table, flowers in cream and gold. The stage was set with a podium. Behind it, a screen was ready to display that slideshow. Former students started arriving around 5 o'clock. I remember hugging a woman named Patricia who I'd counseled through her junior and senior year when her mother was sick. She was a teacher now. She had 2 kids. She pulled me aside and said, "Miss Henderson, I wouldn't be here without you. I mean that literally. I was going to drop out senior year." I cried right there. Then came Marco, who I helped get into Northwestern on a full scholarship. He was an engineer now, making 6 figures. He brought his wife and showed me pictures of his newborn son. He said, "I want him to know about you. I want him to know what it means when someone believes in you when you don't believe in yourself." The room filled with these stories, over and over. People I'd touched, lives I'd helped reshape. And I kept looking toward the entrance. Around 6:30, I saw Deshaun walk in. He was wearing an expensive suit, the kind that costs more than my monthly rent. Melanie was beside him in a dress that probably cost more than my car. She had designer sunglasses on her head, the kind of affectation that says, "I have money and I need you to know it." Ari was with them, sleepy and confused, wearing a dress too formal for a child of rage. My heart lifted just seeing them. Deshaun saw me and waved. Not warmly, just a wave. The kind you give an acquaintance at the grocery store. They sat at a table in the middle of the room. I noticed Melanie whisper something to Deshaun, and he nodded. The dinner started around 7. The food was good. Chicken, salmon, vegetables. People talked and laughed. I kept stealing glances at my son, wondering if he was proud of me, wondering what he was thinking. Around 8 o'clock, my principal stood up. She walked to the podium and talked about my career, about the students I'd helped, about the reputation I'd built. She had statistics, 2,000 counseling sessions over 4 decades. 98% of my students graduated high school, 60% went to college. The room applauded. Then she started introducing speakers. Former students came up one by one. They told stories about me, stories I'd forgotten about, stories where I'd made a difference they'd never told me about. One woman, probably in her 40s now, talked about how I sat with her for an entire lunch period when her father died. She said I never tried to fix her pain. I just sat there and let her feel it. She said that taught me more about being human than anything else ever had. The applause was loud, real, and I looked at Deshaun. He was clapping too, but there was something else in his expression, something I couldn't quite read. My principal turned to the audience and said, "I'd like to invite Deshaun Henderson to say a few words about his mother." My stomach flipped. This was it. This was the moment where my son would stand up and acknowledge what I'd given him, what I'd sacrificed, what we'd been to each other. He stood slowly, straightening his expensive suit. He walked to the podium with the smile on his face, and then he destroyed me.
He tapped the microphone. Once, twice. "Can everyone hear me?" His voice was smooth, confident, like he was about to deliver a boardroom presentation, not talk about his mother. The room quieted. Well, he said, chuckling like he'd already heard the punchline to a joke nobody else knew. My mom has always been something. People laughed nervously. I smiled, unsure where this was going. Growing up, I remember my mom coming home from work every single day. He paused for effect. And she would smell like cafeteria food and diapers. The audience shifted. A few forced laughs. Sometimes like poo, he said, louder now, leaning into the mic like this was the reveal. That smell stayed in our house forever. But hey, I guess that's what happens when you work around kids all day, right? The room froze. I felt my face go numb. Not hot, numb, like someone had reached into my chest and turned my blood cold. A few people laughed, real laughs, like he'd just made a clever joke at a dinner party. Most people went silent. I could feel them looking at me, trying to figure out what they were supposed to do. But seriously, and this is what destroyed me, the casual confidence in his voice. My mom worked hard. I respect that. She just, she made the whole house smell like her job. He smiled like he'd just given me a compliment. Melanie laughed, not a nervous laugh, a real, genuine laugh, like she'd been waiting for this moment, like she'd maybe even coached him on what to say. Someone in the back of the room said, "Oh my." Another voice, "Lord have mercy." I was still smiling. I don't know why. My body went on autopilot, the reflex of a woman who'd spent her whole life smoothing over conflict, minimizing pain, making things okay for everyone around her. But inside, something broke. Not gradually, all at once. I realized in that moment what was happening. This wasn't a joke that landed wrong. This wasn't a son trying to be funny and missing the mark. This was intentional. This was calculated. He'd stood up in front of 300 people, people who loved me, people I'd helped, people who traveled across the city to celebrate my life, and he'd deliberately humiliated me. Why? That's what I couldn't understand. Why would he do that? My hands started shaking. I pressed them flat against the table so nobody would see. Deshaun continued talking. He said something about how I was dedicated to my job, how I always prioritized my students, that meant a lot. But every word felt like a knife twist, because we both knew what he'd just done. We both knew he'd used those sacrifices against me. Melanie was texting on her phone now, smiling to herself. Ari looked uncomfortable. She kept tugging on her mother's sleeve. "Mommy, why is everyone quiet?" Melanie didn't answer her. My principal's expression had changed. She looked disappointed, not in me, in him. She was watching Deshaun like she was seeing him clearly for the first time, and he wasn't who she thought he was. He finished his speech by saying he was proud of his mother and her years of service. He said it like he was reading from a script, like the words meant nothing to him. Then he walked back to his seat and sat down. The applause was scattered, confused. I sat there for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. My mind was racing. Was I supposed to pretend that just happened? Was I supposed to laugh it off? Was I supposed to let my son humiliate me in front of the entire community I'd served for 40 decades and just smile? I looked at the faces around me. I saw pity. I saw anger on my behalf. I saw people wondering how a woman who had given so much to the world had raised a son who could be so cruel. And in that moment, something shifted inside me. Not rage, not yet, but a cold clarity. This wasn't about a joke that landed wrong. This wasn't a son who'd made a mistake. This was about a man who looked at his mother and decided she was small enough to hurt in public. He'd made a choice, and I was about to make one right back.
I stood up slowly. The room was still in that awkward silence. People were unsure what to do with the discomfort. My principal was still watching me, waiting to see how I'd respond. I walked to the podium. I didn't rush. I didn't stomp. I just moved with the kind of quiet purpose that comes from knowing exactly what I'm about to do. I tapped the microphone. The feedback made people wince. Good. I wanted them to feel something. "Well," I said, and my voice was steady, steadier than I felt. "Thank you, son. I didn't realize the sacrifices I made smelled so bad to you." The room inhaled collectively. I wasn't angry. That's what threw people off. I was calm, but there was steel in my voice. The kind of tone that comes from someone who stopped protecting you and started protecting herself. "You're right," I continued. "I came home tired. I came home sweaty. I came home sometimes smelling like diapers and cafeteria food because I was working, serving, giving to students, to families, and mostly to you." I paused and let my eyes find his in the crowd. He was looking down. "You stand here today, a college graduate with a good job and a stable life. You stand here in a suit that probably costs more than I make in a month. You're married to a woman who gets to shop at stores I can't pronounce. You have a beautiful daughter who will never know what it feels like to wonder if you can afford the electricity bill." Melanie's smile disappeared. "Why do you have all of that?" I asked. "Not because you're smarter than anyone else, not because you're special. You have it because I chose you. I chose you over dating. I chose you over rest. I chose you over my own dreams." The room was silent. Not uncomfortable silence anymore. Listening silence. I worked in a school that didn't pay me enough. I counseled kids that weren't mine like they were. I bought pencils out of my own pocket and food for students who didn't have lunch money. And every single dollar I didn't spend on myself went to you. I looked directly at him now. But if all you remember is a smell, if the only thing that stands out from your childhood is that your mother came home exhausted from building other people's futures, then I guess the problem isn't what I brought home. The problem is what you lacked in your heart. The applause started slow. Then it built. People were standing. Former students were wiping their eyes. Ari was clapping without fully understanding, just knowing that her grandmother had done something important. Melanie looked like someone had slapped her. Deshaun's jaw was tight. His neck was red. He wasn't looking at me anymore. I wasn't done, but I knew when to let silence speak louder than words. I stepped away from the podium and walked back to my table. The applause continued. My principal came over and hugged me. She whispered, "That took courage." I told her the truth. That took clarity. Because that's what it was. For the first time in years, I was seeing my son clearly. Not as the child I'd raised, not as the man I'd hoped he'd become, but as someone who resented me for showing him what sacrifice actually looks like. He'd humiliated me because my existence made him uncomfortable. And that's when I realized I'd spent 42 years teaching other people's children how to be good, how to be kind, how to be grateful. My own son hadn't learned the first lesson. The question was, what was I going to do about it?
I didn't cry that night. I thought I would. I thought I'd go home and fall apart the way my body wanted to. But instead, I sat in my car in the parking garage for an hour and just existed. People tried to follow me out. My principal wanted to make sure I was okay. Former students wanted to hug me and tell me I was strong. Ari ran up to me as I was leaving and squeezed my legs. "Grandma, you were so brave." I held her and felt something break inside me that I didn't know was still whole. But I couldn't let anyone see it yet. I drove home to my small house in the neighborhood Melanie had called dated. I made tea. I sat on my porch. And I let the weight of what had happened sink in. My son had publicly shamed me. That was the surface-level truth. But underneath it was something heavier. He'd done it deliberately. He'd stood in front of my community and made me into a punchline. And the cruelest part, he'd done it in a way that sounded almost affectionate, like it was a story about how hardworking I was, with a side dish of humiliation. That's calculated cruelty. That's not a mistake. Around midnight, I poured myself a glass of wine, something I rarely do, and I sat in the dark asking myself questions I wasn't sure I wanted answered. Why would my son do this? Was it really about the smell? Was it about his embarrassment at where he came from? Was Melanie encouraging this? Or had he arrived at this cruelty all on his own? And the bigger question, what had I done wrong in raising him that he thought this was acceptable? I spent the whole night cycling through guilt and anger. Guilt because I'd somehow failed to teach him kindness. Anger because I'd done everything right and he'd still chosen to hurt me. By 3 a.m, I realized something. I was asking the wrong questions. The real question wasn't what I'd done wrong. The real question was why I was spending my emotional energy trying to understand a grown man's cruelty instead of protecting myself from it. I was still in that phase where I believed there was a reason that would make sense, or I thought if I just understood his motivation, I could fix it. I could fix him. I could make him remember that I was his mother and he loved me. That's the trap a parent falls into. You're always trying to rescue your child, even when your child is the one hurting you. I made a decision that night. I wasn't going to reach out to him. I wasn't going to apologize for calling him out. I wasn't going to do the emotional labor of smoothing things over so we could pretend this hadn't happened. He'd made his choice. Now I was going to make mine. I went to bed as the sun was rising, and I slept better than I had in years. When I woke up around noon the next day, I felt different, lighter somehow, like I'd finally set down a weight I didn't realize I'd been carrying. I showered. I made breakfast. I sat at my kitchen table with my coffee and my retirement papers spread out in front of me. And that's when something caught my eye. I was reviewing the documents that had come with my retirement package, the same ones I'd left on the dining table during Deshawn's visit 3 months ago, the ones I'd asked him to help me sort through while I ran upstairs to get Ari's sweater. My retirement account beneficiary form. I pulled it closer. I looked at the signature line. My stomach dropped.
The signature didn't look right. Now, I want you to understand, I know my own signature. I've signed my name on thousands of documents over 42 years. I know the way I cross my T's, I know the slope of my L's, I know the exact pressure I apply to the pen. This signature was wrong. It was close. Someone had tried to match my handwriting, but it wasn't mine. The S was too loopy, the H was too tall, and there was a little flourish at the end that I would never, ever add. My hand started shaking. I pulled out other documents, my actual signature on previous forms. I compared them side by side. Forgery. That was the word that appeared in my brain. Forgery. A crime. A felony. My own son had forged my signature on my retirement paperwork. I read the form again, slowly this time. The beneficiary had been changed from Lorraine Henderson, primary beneficiary, to Deshawn Henderson and Melanie Henderson, co-beneficiaries. My entire life savings, over 4 decades of earning, saving, sacrificing. I'd never made much money, but I'd been careful. I'd invested wisely. I'd skipped vacations and dinners out. I'd worn the same coat for 7 years. And it was all set to go to a man who'd humiliated me. No, not set to go. Set to go when I died. That's what made my skin crawl. He hadn't just stolen from me. He'd set up a system where my death would benefit him, where my absence would make him richer. How long had this been in place? 3 months? Longer? I thought back to that day he'd asked me to run upstairs. I'd left the papers on the table. Ari's sweater was in my bedroom, and it should have taken me 2 minutes to get it. But I'd stopped to answer an email. I'd spent maybe 5 minutes away from the table.
Had that been enough time for him to photograph the document, to figure out how to forge it, to submit it to HR? Or had he already planned this? Had he asked Ari to wear something that needed retrieving specifically so he'd have time? I didn't want to believe that. I wanted to believe it was impulsive, that he'd seen the form and made a stupid decision on the spot. But I was starting to understand that my son wasn't stupid. He was strategic. I went to my desk and pulled up my email. I searched for anything from HR about my retirement account. And there it was. An email from 3 months ago confirming the beneficiary change. 3 months ago was 1 week after that visit. I clicked on the HR representative's name and wrote down her extension. Then I did something I'd never done before. I called my bank and asked about my investment accounts. I asked if anyone else had access. I asked if there had been any unusual activity. The banker told me everything was secure under my name. Nothing unusual had occurred. Small mercy. I hung up and sat with the phone in my lap. I could call HR tomorrow. I could ask them about that form. I could ask if they needed my verification. I could report this to the police. But first, I needed to know the full extent of what he'd done. I pulled out every document I had, every statement, every legal paper. I went through my filing cabinet like a detective at a crime scene, looking for other signatures that didn't match mine. House deed? All me. Car title? All me. Insurance policies? All me. But there were little things. A change of address form I didn't remember submitting. A phone number update on my bank account that wasn't my current number. Nothing major, but enough to show a pattern. Enough to show he'd been testing the waters, figuring out what he could access and change without getting caught. And he'd succeeded. Until I looked at that retirement form with fresh eyes. I sat back in my chair and stared at nothing. My son wasn't just ungrateful. He wasn't just cruel. He was a thief. And worse, he was a thief with a plan. He'd been waiting for me to die.
The HR letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, not an email, an actual letter in a physical envelope with the school district's seal. I almost didn't open it. I almost threw it away, thinking it was something administrative. But something told me to read it. I'm glad I did. The letter was congratulating me on my retirement. It was acknowledging my 42 years of service. But buried in the middle of all the pleasantries was a sentence that made me go cold. We want to confirm that the beneficiary update you requested 3 months ago has been processed and filed according to your specifications. Requested. As if I'd gone to HR myself and made this change. I'd done no such thing. But that's where Deshaun had been clever. He hadn't just forged my signature on the document. He'd had it officially processed. He'd made it legal. He'd buried the crime in a stack of retirement paperwork, so it looked routine. I read the letter again, and again, and again. Then I called HR. I asked to speak with the person who'd processed my beneficiary change. The woman who picked up was bright, efficient, helpful. I asked her when the form had been submitted. 3 months ago, Miss Henderson, right on schedule before your retirement. I asked if she'd verified the signature. There was a pause. We do verify signatures, Miss Henderson, but for routine beneficiary changes, we typically process them quickly if they're submitted by the employee or a close family member acting on behalf of the employee. A close family member. He must have submitted it in person, must have said something like, "My mother asked me to drop this off for her." And they'd believed him because why wouldn't they? He looked professional. He probably had a copy of an ID showing we shared a last name. I told the HR representative that I needed to report a problem with that form, that my signature had been forged, that the beneficiary change had been made without my knowledge or consent. The line went quiet. Miss Henderson, that's a serious allegation. It's not an allegation, I said calmly. It's a fact. I'm looking at your letter right now. I never submitted that form. My signature is a forgery. There was shuffling. I could hear her pulling up files on her computer. We'll need to initiate an investigation. This will need to go to compliance and potentially to our legal department. And the police, I added. This is fraud. When I hung up, I felt something shift inside me. I wasn't the victim anymore. I was the person with evidence, with documentation, with the upper hand. Deshaun had made a mistake. He'd tried to be clever, but he'd left a paper trail. And now that trail was leading straight back to him.
I drove to their house that same afternoon. I hadn't called ahead. I hadn't warned him. I just showed up. Their house was in a gated community with manicured lawns and driveways that probably cost more than my entire mortgage. It was the kind of place where neighbors don't know each other and wouldn't care if they did. Perfect place for secrets. I rang the doorbell at 3 o'clock. Melanie answered. She was wearing workout clothes, expensive ones, and her hair was in a perfect top knot. She looked annoyed to see me. "Lorraine, we weren't expecting—" "I know you weren't," I said. "Is my son home?" She hesitated for just a second, but I saw it. "Deshaun," she called out, not taking her eyes off me. "Your mother's here." He appeared from somewhere in the back of the house. When he saw me, his whole body went tense. He knew. Some part of him immediately understood that I'd discovered something. "Mom, hey, what's going on?" "Can we talk?" I asked. Inside. Melanie tried to close the door behind us, but I didn't let her shut me out this time. We stood in their foyer, all marble and modern art and money I could never fathom having. It was the kind of place where neighbors don't know each other and wouldn't care if they did. Perfect place for secrets. "I received a letter from HR today," I said. My voice was steady. I was proud of that, congratulating me on my retirement and confirming that my beneficiary change had been processed. Deshaun's face went white. A change I never made, a change I never signed off on, a change that now lists you and your wife as beneficiaries on an account worth approximately $180,000? Melanie's eyes widened. So she didn't know he'd changed it to include her. Interesting. "Mom, I can explain," Deshaun started. "You forged my signature on official retirement documents and submitted them to HR without my knowledge or consent. That's fraud. That's a felony." "It's not fraud. It's planning. You won't need that money for long anyway." I turned to her slowly. "What did you just say?" "We figured when your health declines, and at your age, it will. Someone will need to make decisions. We're just being prepared." The audacity. The absolute audacity. "You're waiting for me to die," I said. Not a question, a statement. Deshaun looked away. The coward couldn't even meet my eyes. "You publicly humiliated me at my retirement party. You called me a joke in front of 300 people, and then you came home and forged my name on documents so you could collect my money when I'm gone." "Mom, you're being dramatic," Deshaun said. "Am I?" I pulled out the HR letter. "Then explain this. Explain why your signature appears on a form submitted on your behalf 3 weeks after you were in my house, unsupervised with my retirement paperwork." He looked at Melanie. She looked back at him with something that wasn't quite support, more like calculation, like she was wondering if her husband was smart enough to handle this. "We were going to tell you," Deshaun said weakly. "We just thought—" "You thought I wouldn't notice? You thought I would never look at my own documents? You thought I would just die and you'd collect your inheritance and nobody would ever know you were a thief?" My voice wasn't raised. That was the terrifying part. I was speaking in a low, controlled tone that somehow sounded worse than if I'd been screaming. "You became embarrassing to you, so you decided I should disappear. And if I wasn't going to disappear on my own, you'd wait for death to do it for you." Ari appeared at the top of the stairs. She'd heard voices raised and was checking to see if everything was okay. I looked at her, my granddaughter, with her cocoa-colored curls and her worried eyes.
I looked at her, my granddaughter, with her cocoa-colored curls and her worried eyes. "Come here, baby," I said gently. She started down the stairs and Melanie grabbed her arm. "Ari, go upstairs." "Let her go," I said. Melanie's grip tightened. I stepped forward, and something in my face must have told her I meant business, because she released Ari's arm. Ari ran to me, and I held her tight. I whispered in her hair, "Always remember, baby, love doesn't sound like shame. Love doesn't make plans for your death." I looked at Deshawn over Ari's head. "You've made your choice. Now you get to live with the consequences." I walked towards the door, still holding Ari. "What are you doing?" Melanie demanded. "You can't just take her." "I'm not taking her. I'm saying goodbye." I set Ari down and kissed her forehead. Then I walked out of that house, knowing I would never be back.
I didn't go to the police immediately. That might seem strange, but I had a reason. I drove home and sat at my kitchen table with a cup of tea and a legal pad. And I made a list. Not a list of what I was going to do to Deshawn. A list of what I was going to do for myself. Here's what I realized. The police would investigate. They might press charges. He might face consequences. But that would take time. And it would put me in the position of victim in a legal system. Testifying, reliving the betrayal over and over. I didn't want to be a victim. I wanted to be strategic. So I made a plan. First, I was going to move my retirement account into a trust that he couldn't touch, even if he begged God himself. I was going to get a lawyer and make sure that money was protected in a way that no forgery could ever reach. Second, I was going to change my will. Everything was going to Ari. Not Deshawn, not Melanie, my granddaughter. I was going to make sure that when I died, my legacy went to someone who actually appreciated it. Third, I was going to record everything. I was going to create a video explaining the forgery, the confrontation, the calculated nature of his betrayal, and I was going to send it to people who mattered. Our church, his employer, his in-laws. I wasn't going to be quiet about this. Deshawn had made a choice to humiliate me publicly. He'd decided that shame was an acceptable weapon. Fine. I was going to show him that truth could be won too. But here's what made this different from revenge. I was going to be honest. I wasn't going to exaggerate or lie or embellish. I was simply going to tell the truth about what he'd done and let people form their own opinions. I spent that night on the phone with a lawyer. By midnight, I'd initiated the legal process to move my retirement funds. By morning, I'd started the paperwork to amend my will. I wasn't angry anymore. I was clear. Deshawn had treated me like I was disposable, like my death was just a waiting game before he could access what I'd built. He was about to learn that I'd spent 42 years building things that mattered, and I wasn't done building yet.
The lawyer I hired was a woman named Patricia Chen. She was sharp, efficient, and most importantly, she didn't treat me like I was overreacting. When I showed her the forged documents and explained what had happened, she didn't hesitate. "This is criminal," she said, "but it's also civil. We can pursue both paths." I told her I wanted to pursue the financial protection first. I wanted to make sure my money was safe before anything else. She explained the options. A trust would protect me. An irrevocable trust would be the strongest option. Once money went in, nobody could touch it without my explicit consent, even by forging documents. It would require me to move the funds, but it would be worth it. We set up an appointment with a financial advisor. Within 2 weeks, I'd moved my retirement account into a trust with Ari as the beneficiary. Not because I wanted to punish Deshawn by giving it to his daughter, though there was some poetry in that, but because Ari deserved better. Because she was the innocent party in all of this. Because my legacy should go to someone who might actually learn something from it.
The financial advisor asked me if I was concerned about how this might affect my relationship with my son. My relationship with my son is already destroyed, I said. I'm just making sure he can't destroy my legacy along with it. Next came the legal move against the fraudulent beneficiary change. I filed a police report. I provided them with the forged documents, the HR letter, and my testimony. The detective assigned to the case took it seriously. He told me what would happen next. They'd investigate, they'd likely bring charges, and if it went to trial, I'd have to testify. I told him I was ready. Then came the part that terrified me most, telling people. I drafted an email to our church community. I wrote it carefully, factually, without emotion. I explained what Deshaun had done. I included copies of the forged documents. I explained that I was reporting it to law enforcement and pursuing legal remedies. I sent it to 40 people. Within hours, my phone was ringing. People I hadn't talked to in years were calling. Former colleagues, church members. They were horrified. They were supporting me. They were angry on my behalf. I also sent the email to Melanie's family. That was the moment things shifted. Within 3 days, Melanie's mother called Deshaun. Her father had a conversation with him. Her siblings were suddenly aware of exactly what kind of man their sister had married. The image Melanie had carefully cultivated, the successful couple, the powerful pair, the modern family rising above their circumstances, suddenly had a crack in it. And that crack was growing. I didn't have to do anything else. The truth was doing the work for me. Because people don't like criminals. And people really don't like criminals who prey on their own mothers. The legal system would take its course. The police would build their case. The prosecutors would decide whether to move forward. But in the meantime, I'd already won the only battle that mattered. I'd taken back my power. I'd stopped being a victim and become a witness. And I'd made sure that when this story came out, and it would, the world would know exactly what kind of man Deshaun Henderson really was.
What I didn't expect was how fast the story would spread. The email I sent to 40 people turned into 100 conversations. Those 100 conversations turned into a story that reached people I'd never intended to contact. Within a week, it had reached Deshaun's workplace. He worked for a financial firm, the kind of place where reputation and trust are currency, where clients invest millions based on confidence that the people handling their money are ethical, where a scandal involving fraud can destroy a career in days. I didn't send anything to his employer. I didn't have to. Apparently, one of the emails I sent went to someone whose brother worked in HR at Deshaun's company. That person mentioned it to someone else, and that person realized they knew who Deshaun was. By the time his boss called him into her office, the story had been told and retold enough times that it had taken on a life of its own. I heard about it from a former student who knew someone at the firm. Deshaun was placed on immediate suspension, pending an investigation. I won't lie, there was a moment when I felt something like satisfaction. But it wasn't triumph. It was relief. Relief that he was finally facing consequences. Relief that the world was seeing him the way I'd been forced to see him. But that wasn't even the biggest impact. Melanie's family moved fast. Her mother called me directly. She was crying. She said, "Lorraine, I don't know what to say. I raised my daughter better than this. I'm so sorry for how she's treated you." Her father hired a lawyer of his own to separate their daughter's finances from Deshaun's. They were preparing for a potential lawsuit against him, worried that their own family money might have been at risk. And Melanie herself disappeared. Not literally, but from their social circles, from the country club, from the charity galas she'd been attending. She stopped posting on social media. She stopped showing her face at events. I heard through the grapevine that she'd moved into a hotel for a few weeks while she figured out whether she was staying in the marriage. The image they'd built together, the perfect power couple, had shattered like glass. And the most devastating part for them, they had done it to themselves. I'd simply told the truth. About 2 weeks into the fallout, Melanie called me.
I almost didn't answer, but something told me to pick up. "Lorraine," she said. Her voice was small, broken, nothing like the confident woman who'd mocked me at family dinners. "Yes?" I wanted to apologize for everything, for how I treated you, for not stopping Deshawn, she started crying, for all of it. I listened to her cry for a moment. "Melanie, your apology doesn't fix what happened. It doesn't undo the forgery. It doesn't undo the humiliation. But I hear you. Deshawn's talking about giving the money back, the retirement account. He wants to restore the original beneficiary. I don't want his money," I said calmly. "I want him to face what he did. The courts will decide what that means." I hung up, and I realized something in that moment. I didn't need him to apologize. I didn't need him to understand. I didn't need his money or his regret. I needed my life back, and I was getting it.
The police investigation took 3 months. They interviewed Deshawn, who lawyered up immediately. They interviewed people at HR who confirmed the suspicious nature of the beneficiary change. They analyzed the forged documents and compared them to my actual signature. By the end of it, they had more than enough to press charges: fraud, document forgery, conspiracy to commit theft. When the charges were filed, it made local news. "Local man charged with forging mother's signature on retirement documents." The headline was humiliating for him in a way I knew would sting. But here's what surprised me. I didn't feel good about it. I thought I would. I thought watching him face consequences would feel like justice. Instead, it felt heavy. I sat with that feeling for a while, and I realized what it was: grief. I was grieving the son I'd hoped he'd be. The son who would one day look back at everything I'd sacrificed and feel gratitude. The son who would become the man I'd tried to raise him to be. That son didn't exist. He'd never existed. But mourning the idea of him mattered. Deshawn didn't show up to family events anymore. Not that I was going to them either, but I heard through the grapevine that he'd become a pariah in the circles where he'd once thrived. Melanie filed for divorce 6 months after the story broke. I heard she was moving back in with her parents while she figured out her next step. The sophisticated woman who'd mocked my small house was now depending on her family's support. Ari stayed with Deshawn half the time, per the custody arrangement. The other half she was with Melanie. And every weekend she could, she came to me. I'd ask her about school, about her friends, about what made her happy. And she'd tell me stories in that innocent way children do. Completely unfiltered, completely honest. She never asked why her parents weren't together anymore. Or maybe she did, but she understood at some level that it wasn't my burden to explain. What mattered was that she still loved me, and I still loved her. The rest was just the wreckage of adult choices.
6 months after everything happened, Ari and I started a tradition. Every Saturday morning, we'd bake together. It started small, just cookies, but it grew into something bigger. We'd make biscuits and bread. We'd make pies and cakes. And while we cooked, she'd talk. She told me about the boy in her class who liked her, about the teacher who made her feel smart, about the girl who wasn't being kind to her, and what she did to stand up for herself. And I listened, not as her grandmother giving advice, but as someone who cared enough to witness her life. One Saturday, while we were pulling a batch of biscuits from the oven, Ari said something that made me stop moving. "Grandma, when I grow up, I want to smell like you, like warm bread and love." I cried right there in my kitchen, flour on my hands, biscuits cooling on the rack. "Why are you crying?" she asked, concerned. "Because you just made me the happiest I've been in a long time," I said. She hugged me, and I realized something. This
was what it had all been for. Not the career, not the accolades, not the recognition I'd gotten from the school community. It was this moment, this girl, this love that was simple and pure and uncomplicated. All those years I'd spent trying to be everything for everyone, I'd lost sight of what actually mattered. I'd poured myself into my job, into my students, into my son. But this, time with Ari, watching her grow, listening to her dreams, this was the real work. This was the legacy that actually mattered. I started spending more time with her. Not just weekends. I'd pick her up from school sometimes. I'd help with homework. I'd be present in the small moments that add up to a childhood. And I noticed something. She was thriving. She was kinder to herself, more confident. She wasn't carrying the weight of her parents' failures the way children often do. Because she had me showing her what unconditional love looked like. She had a grandmother who showed up, who listened, who baked with her on Saturday mornings and let her know she mattered.
Here's the thing nobody knew. I was going to change my will anyway, long before the forgery, long before the humiliation, long before any of this happened. I'd been thinking about it for years, actually, about what it meant to leave a legacy, about what I wanted my life to add up to. I had $180,000. It was a life's work, 42 years of sacrifices, every penny saved, every indulgence denied. And I could have left it all to Deshaun, let him sell my house and split the proceeds and move on with his life. But that never sat right with me. Because the real work of my life wasn't in the money. It was in the students. It was in the lives I'd changed. It was in every scholarship I'd helped secure, every kid I'd convinced not to drop out, every single young person who'd walked into my office broken and walked out believing in themselves. So, I made a decision. I donated $110,000 to the school to create a scholarship fund in my name, the Lorraine Henderson Scholarship for Students with Single Parents. Every year, it would award money to 3 students: kids without fathers or mothers, kids who were fighting to stay in school, kids who needed someone to believe in them. The remaining $70,000 went into a trust for Ari. Not a trust she could access whenever she wanted. A trust that would support her through college. A trust that said, "You are valued. Your future matters to me." I told nobody about the scholarship until the paperwork was finalized. When I announced it at a school assembly, I saw something shift in the faces of the faculty. They understood what it meant. I wasn't just retiring. I was leaving something behind. Something that would keep working even after I was gone. A teacher came up to me afterward and said, "Miss Henderson, that's incredible. Your legacy is going to help thousands of students." But I told her the truth. My legacy isn't the scholarship. My legacy is every student who learned to believe in themselves. The scholarship is just the tool. The real work was always the people. And that's what I understood in that moment. I'd spent 42 years building something that mattered. And no betrayal, not from my son, not from anyone, could take that away from me. Because it wasn't about money. It was never about money. It was about the mark we leave on the world through love and service and showing up for people who desperately need someone to show up for them. I want to be honest with you right now. This story isn't about revenge. It's about reclaiming your power when someone you trust tries to take it from you. It's about understanding that sometimes the people closest to us will disappoint us in ways we never saw coming. And when that happens, you have a choice. You can crumble, or you can stand up and protect what matters most.
I chose to stand up. I reported the forgery. I protected my finances. I told the truth to people who needed to hear it. And I didn't do it to punish Deshaun. Though consequences are a natural outcome of his actions, I did it because I deserved better. Because my life's work deserved better. Because I refused to be someone's victim anymore. Here's what I learned through all of this. Your sacrifices don't obligate anyone to be grateful. Your love doesn't guarantee loyalty. Your kindness doesn't ensure that people will treat you with respect. But that doesn't mean your sacrifices were wasted. That doesn't mean your love was wrong. That doesn't mean you should stop showing up for the people in your life. It means you need to be strategic about who you trust. It means you need to protect yourself. It means you need to know your own worth so that when someone tries to diminish it, you have the clarity to see it for what it is, their failure, not yours. I'm telling you this story because I know there are people watching right now who are in similar situations. Maybe your child has disappointed you. Maybe your family has betrayed you. Maybe you've been humiliated by someone you loved. I want you to know you're not alone, and you don't have to accept mistreatment just because it comes from family. You deserve respect. You deserve honesty. You deserve people who appreciate what you've given them. And if they can't give you that, you deserve the strength to walk away and build something better. That's what I did, and I'm still standing. Lastly, download your ebook titled Suspense and Family Drama Short Stories by clicking the link in the pinned comment. This book is full of stories just like mine, stories about real people facing real betrayals and choosing to reclaim their lives. Your journey might be different from mine, but your strength is just as real. Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for caring enough to follow along. And thank you for reminding me that when we share our truth, we give other people permission to do the same. Subscribe for more emotional, dramatic, real-life inspired family stories, because your story matters, and so do you.